Hey guys, how you good, yeah? It's our third reading of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, guys. Here we go. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large and their residence was at Norland Park in the centre of their property, where for many generations they had lived in so respectful a manner as to engage in the general good option of their surrounding acquaintance. The late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age, and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home to supply her loss. He invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to all then increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not narrowly from interest, but from goodness of heart, gave every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive, and the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. By former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son. By his present lady, 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother, which had been large, and half of which devolved on him on his coming of age. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters. For their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their fathers inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his disposal. The remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune was also secured to her child, and he had only a life interest in it. The old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, that he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son. But his son and his son's sons, a child of 4 years old, it was secured in such a way as to leave to himself no power of providing for those who were most dear to him, and who most needed the provision by any charge on the estate, or by any sale of its valuable woods. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child, who, in occasional visits with his father and mother at Norland, had so far gained on the affections of his uncle thy such attractions as are by no means unusual in in children of 2 or 3 years old, and in perfect articulation and earnest desire of having his own way, many cunning tricks and a great deal of noise, as to outweigh all the value of all the attention which the years he had received from his niece and her daughters. He meant not to be unkind, however, and as a mark of his affection for the 3 girls, he left them £1,000 apiece. Mr. Dashwood's disappointment was at first severe, that his temper was cheerful and sanguine, and he might reasonably hope to live many years, and by living economically lay by a considerable sum from the produce of an estate already large, and capable of almost immediate improvement of the fortune which had been so tardy and cunning, was his only 12th month. Was only his 12th month. He survived his uncle no longer, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widows and daughters. His son was sent for as soon as his daughter was known, and to him Mr. Dashwood recommended with all the strength and urgency which illness could command the interest of his mother-in-law and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, that he was affected by the recommendation of such a nature at such a time, and he promised to do everything in his power to make them comfortable. His father was rendered easily by such an assurance, and Mr. John Dashwood had then leisure to consider how much there might prudently be in his power to do for them. Apologies there, guys. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. That he was in general well respected, for he conducted himself with priority in the discharge of his ordinary duties, had he married a more admirable woman. He might have been made still more respectable than he was. He might even have been made admirable himself, for he was very young when he married, and very fond of his wife. That Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. When he gave his promise to his father, he meditated within himself to increase the fortunes of his sister by the present of £1,000 apiece. He then really thought himself equal to it. The prospect of £4,000 a year, in addition to his present income, besides the remaining half of his mother's fortune, warmed his heart, and made him feel capable of generosity. Yes, he would give them £3,000. It would be liberal and handsome. It would be enough to make them completely easy. £3,000, he could spare so considerable a sum with little inconvenience. He thought of it all day long, and for many days successfully, and he did not repent. No sooner was his father's funeral over than Mrs. John Dashwood, without spending any notice of her intention to her mother-in-law, arrived with her child and their attendants. No one could dispute her right to come. The house was her husband's from the moment of his father's decease, but the indecency of her conduct was so much the greater, and to learn this is Dashwood's situation with only common feelings must have been highly unpleasing. That in her mind there was a sense of honour so keen, a generosity so romantic, that any offence of the kind by whomsoever given or received was to her a source of immovable disgust.